7-year-old Mason Pierce sat alone in the dark living room of his grandmother's house, staring at the single cupcake she had left for him before her shift at the hospital. No candles, no songs, no friends. His father had died 2 years earlier in a factory accident, and his mother had abandoned him 6 months ago, disappearing without a word, leaving only a note that said she couldn't do this anymore. His grandmother worked double shifts just to keep the lights on, and Mason had learned not to ask for much. He didn't even tell her it was his birthday. He just sat there, 7 years old, watching the clock tick past midnight, wondering if anyone in the world remembered he existed. What Mason didn't know was that his father, before he died, had been part of something bigger than himself. David Pierce had ridden with the Iron Vow Brotherhood, a crew of bikers who lived by one unbreakable rule. A promise made is a promise kept, no matter how much time passes. And 2 years ago, on his deathbed, David had made his brothers swear an oath. "If anything happens to me," he had whispered, "make sure my boy never spends a birthday alone. Make sure he knows he's not forgotten." For 2 years, the Brotherhood had quietly watched over Mason from a distance, making sure his grandmother's bills got paid anonymously, that his school supplies appeared when needed, that someone was always nearby if danger came close, but they had never revealed themselves. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight was Mason's 7th birthday, and the crew had decided it was time to honor their fallen brother's final wish in a way the boy would never forget. At 11:43 p.m., Mason heard it, a low rumble in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Then another, and another. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain, his breath catching in his throat. Down the quiet suburban street, headlights appeared, dozens of them moving in perfect formation. Motorcycles, 57 of them to be exact. Each rider wore a leather vest with the same patch, a steel fist gripping a burning torch, and beneath it the words, "Iron Vow Brotherhood." They rolled to a stop in front of his grandmother's house, engines idling in unison, filling the night air with thunder. The lead rider dismounted, a man with silver hair, weathered hands, and eyes that had seen too much loss. His name was Marcus "Hawk" Donovan, and he had been David Pierce's closest friend. He walked up to the front door and knocked 3 times. When Mason opened it, trembling and confused, Hawk knelt down to his level and spoke in a voice that was both gentle and unshakable. "Your daddy was my brother," he said, "and he made us promise something before he left this world. He made us promise that you'd never be alone, not on your birthday, not ever." Behind Hawk, the 56 other bikers dismounted in silence. They carried bags filled with gifts, a cake with 7 candles, and something even more valuable, the presence of family, the kind you choose, the kind that doesn't leave. What followed that night would change Mason's life forever, setting in motion a chain of events that would test the Brotherhood's honor, bring them face to face with a corrupt system that wanted them gone, and prove that some promises are so sacred they survive even death itself. Mason Pierce turned 7 years old at exactly 4:32 p.m. on a Tuesday, but no one was there to see it happen. He sat cross-legged on the worn carpet of his grandmother's living room, staring at the cupcake she had left on the coffee table before heading to her evening shift at Memorial Hospital. It was chocolate, his favorite, with a thin layer of frosting that had started to crack from sitting out too long. No candle, no card, just the cupcake, sitting there like a small monument to something that should have been bigger. His grandmother hadn't forgotten. She never forgot anything, but she worked 16-hour shifts 3 days a week, and tonight was one of those nights. Mason understood. He was 7 now, which meant he was old enough to understand things like bills and rent, and how sometimes adults had to choose between being there and keeping the lights on. He understood, but that didn't make the room feel any less empty. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. Mason looked around the room, at the faded floral wallpaper his grandmother kept saying she'd replace someday, at the old television set that only got 4 channels, at the framed photograph on the mantel of a man in a leather jacket standing beside a black motorcycle, smiling like he owned the world. His father, David Pierce, dead 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. Mason didn't count the days on purpose. They just lived in his head, ticking forward like a clock he couldn't turn off. Sometimes he dreamed about his father, dreams where they were riding together on that black motorcycle, wind in their faces, going somewhere far away where nothing bad ever happened. But he always woke up before they got there. If you're watching this story unfold, take a moment to reflect on the power of a promise kept, because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity. His mother was a different story. She had left 6 months ago. No warning, no explanation that made sense. Just a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I can't do this anymore, I'm sorry." Mason had read it so many times that the paper had started to tear along the creases. His grandmother had eventually thrown it away, but Mason still remembered every word. He didn't hate his mother, he just didn't understand her. How do you leave someone on purpose? How do you look at your own kid and decide that walking away is easier than staying? Mason pushed the thought aside and focused on the cupcake. He reached out, peeled back the wrapper, and took a small bite. It was dry, too sweet, but he ate it anyway because his grandmother had left it for him, and that meant something. The clock on the wall ticked past 11:30 p.m. Mason should have been in bed. His grandmother would be upset if she came home and found him still awake. But something about tonight felt different. He couldn't explain it. It was like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. He stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the thin curtain to look outside. The street was empty. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. A few houses down, someone's porch light flickered. Everything looked normal. But then he heard it, a sound so faint at first that he thought he might have imagined it. A low rumble, distant, growing. Mason pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging the window. The sound grew louder, deeper, like rolling thunder that didn't stop. It wasn't a car, it wasn't a truck. It was something else, something he recognized from the stories his grandmother used to tell him about his father. Motorcycles, not just one, many. The rumble became a roar, and then, at the far end of the street, headlights appeared. 1, 2, 5, 10, more. They moved in a slow, deliberate line, engines growling in unison, filling the night with a sound that felt alive. Mason's heart hammered in his chest. The motorcycles rolled closer, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. He could see them now, big machines, chrome gleaming under the streetlights, riders in leather vests moving with the kind of precision that came from years of riding together. They were coming toward his house. Mason stepped back from the window, his pulse racing. Were they lost? Were they looking for someone? He didn't know anyone who rode motorcycles. Not anymore. The lead bike slowed as it reached his grandmother's driveway, then the second, then the third, one by one. They pulled in, forming a perfect line along the curb and spilling into the yard. Mason counted them 10, 20, 30. He lost track after 40. The engines cut off in a synchronized wave, and suddenly the street was silent again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This silence was heavy, waiting. Mason stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his hands trembling. Then he heard footsteps on the porch. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. He didn't move. Another knock, firmer this time. Mason walked to the door, his legs shaking. He reached up, turned the lock, and pulled the door open. A man stood on the porch, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair tied back and a face carved by weather and time. He wore a black leather vest covered in patches, and his eyes, grey and steady, looked down at Mason with something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite relief. The man knelt slowly, bringing himself down to Mason's level. "Your name's Mason, right?" he asked. His voice was rough but kind. Mason nodded. "I'm Marcus, but most folks call me Hawk." He paused, glancing over his shoulder at the row of motorcycles lining the street. "Your daddy was my brother, not by blood, by choice. And before he left this world, he made me promise something." Mason's throat tightened. "He made me promise," Hawk continued, "that you'd never spend a birthday alone, that you'd always know you weren't forgotten." Behind Hawk, 56 bikers stood in silence, watching. Mason felt something crack open inside him, something he'd been holding closed for 2 years. Hawk smiled faintly. "Happy birthday, kid. We got some catching up to do." Mason stood in the doorway, staring at the man who called himself Hawk, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. The words felt too big to fit inside his head. "Your daddy was my brother. He made me promise." Hawk rose slowly to his feet, his knees cracking softly in the quiet night air. He gestured toward the street, where the motorcycles sat like silent sentinels under the glow of streetlights. "These men and women behind me," Hawk said, his voice steady and deliberate, "they all knew your father, every single one of them." Mason's eyes drifted past Hawk to the riders standing beside their bikes. Some had gray hair, some had scars. Some looked like they'd seen too much of the world and kept riding anyway. But they all wore the same vest, black leather with patches stitched across the back, and on every vest the same symbol, a steel fist gripping a burning torch. "What does that mean?" Mason asked, pointing at the patch. Hawk glanced down at his own vest, running his thumb over the embroidered torch. "It means we keep our promises, no matter what. Your daddy wore this same patch. He was one of us, Iron Vow Brotherhood, and when a brother makes a vow, it doesn't die with him, it lives on." Mason swallowed hard. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that his father had left something behind besides photographs and fading memories. But he'd learned not to trust promises. His mother had promised to stay. She hadn't. Hawk must have seen the doubt in Mason's eyes because he crouched down again, this time resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know you don't know me, kid. I know this probably feels strange, but your daddy talked about you all the time. He carried your picture in his wallet, showed it to anyone who'd look. He loved you more than anything in this world." Mason's chest tightened. He blinked hard, trying to keep the tears from coming. "And 2 years ago," Hawk continued, his voice softer now, "when your daddy knew his time was running out, he called me to the hospital. He could barely speak, but he grabbed my hand and he said, 'Hawk, promise me my boy never spends a birthday alone. Promise me he knows he's got family.'" Hawk paused, his jaw tightening. "So I promised. We all did. Every man and woman standing out there made that same vow, and tonight we're here to keep it." Mason looked past Hawk again, studying the faces of the riders. One of them, a woman with short black hair and a scar running down her left cheek, gave him a small nod. Another, a man with a thick beard and tattooed arms, raised his hand in a quiet wave. They weren't strangers. Not really. They were his father's family. Hawk stood and turned toward the street, raising his voice so the others could hear. "All right, brothers and sisters, let's show this kid what a real birthday looks like." The riders moved as one, each of them reaching into their saddlebags and pulling out packages wrapped in newspaper, grocery bags, and mismatched paper. They formed a line leading up to the porch, and one by one they approached Mason. The first rider, a man with silver stubble and kind eyes, handed Mason a small box wrapped in brown paper. "Your daddy and I used to work on engines together," he said. "Figured you might like this." Inside was a model motorcycle kit, the kind you had to build piece by piece. The second rider, a younger man with a sleeve of tattoos, set down a duffel bag filled with art supplies. "Your grandma told us you like to draw," he said with a grin. "Keep at it, kid. The world needs more artists. One by one they came. A woman gave him a jacket, small black leather, with his name stitched across the back. Another brought a cake, homemade and lopsided, with 7 candles already lit. Someone else handed him a worn paperback copy of Treasure Island. "Your dad's favorite book," the rider said. He read it 3 times. Mason's arms filled with gifts, his eyes filled with tears. He didn't know these people, but they knew him. They knew his father. And that was enough. When the last rider had placed their gift on the growing pile, Hawk stepped forward again, holding something small in his hand. He opened his palm to reveal a silver ring, simple, unpolished, with a torch engraved on the surface. "This was your daddy's," Hawk said quietly. "He wanted you to have it when you were old enough. I think 7's old enough." Mason took the ring carefully, holding it up to the light. It was too big for his fingers, but he slipped it onto his thumb anyway. Hawk smiled. "Looks good on you." Mason looked up at him, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you wait? Why didn't you come before?" Hawk's smile faded slightly. "We were watching, kid. We've been watching since the day your daddy died. Made sure your grandma's bills got paid. Made sure you had what you needed, but we wanted to wait until you were ready, until you could understand what it meant." What meant? That you're not alone, that you've got 57 brothers and sisters who'll ride through fire for you if they have to. Mason felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't name. It wasn't happiness. Exactly. It was bigger than that. Heavier, like a door opening in a room he didn't know existed. Hawk placed a hand on his shoulder again. "Your daddy made us promise to be there for you. And we will. Birthdays, bad days, good days, doesn't matter. You call, we come. That's the vow." Mason nodded, unable to speak. Hawk turned back to the riders. "All right, let's light this cake and sing this kid a proper birthday song." The riders gathered around the porch, 57 voices strong, and sang, off-key, loud and full of heart. Mason stood in the center of it all, surrounded by strangers who weren't strangers anymore, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel alone. When the song ended, Hawk handed him a knife. "Make a wish, kid, and make it a good one." Mason closed his eyes, thought of his father, and blew out the candles. The night roared with cheers. The cake was gone within an hour. So were most of the gifts, carried inside by riders who moved with the quiet efficiency of people used to working together. Mason sat on the porch steps, watching as they cleaned up, packed away trash, and checked their bikes under the glow of the streetlights. His grandmother's house had never felt so full. Hawk sat down beside him, a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, sipping slowly, letting the night settle around them. Mason broke the silence. "Did my dad talk about me a lot?" Hawk glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "All the time. Drove us crazy, actually." Mason blinked. "Really?" "Oh, yeah." Hawk chuckled softly. "Every ride, every campfire, every damn time we stopped for food. Mason did this. Mason said that. He was proud of you, kid, prouder than I've ever seen a man be." Mason looked down at the silver ring on his thumb. "I don't remember him that well." Hawk nodded. "You were young. That's okay. Memories fade, but the love doesn't. That stays." "How do you know?" "Because I see it." Hawk gestured toward the street where the riders were still moving, still working. "Every person out there knew your daddy, and every one of them is here because of what he meant to us. That's not memory, kid. That's legacy." Mason thought about that for a moment. What was he like before he died? Hawk leaned back, resting his elbows on the step behind him. "Your daddy was the kind of guy who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. Didn't matter if he knew you or not. If you were in trouble, he'd show up. No questions asked." He paused. He was also stubborn as hell. Once he made up his mind about something, you couldn't change it. Not with logic, not with threats. He just believed in things, in people, in promises. Is that why he made you promise to take care of me? Yeah. Hawk's voice softened. That's why. Mason hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting in his chest all night. Do you think he knew that he was going to die? Hawk didn't answer right away. He stared out at the street, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. Yeah, he finally said. I think he knew. The accident at the factory, he got hurt bad, real bad. By the time they got him to the hospital, the doctors said there wasn't much they could do, but he didn't waste time feeling sorry for himself. He called me. He called a few of the others, and he made us promise. What else did he say? Hawk's expression tightened. He said, don't let my boy grow up thinking nobody cares. Don't let him think he's alone. He turned to look at Mason, his grey eyes steady. So that's what we're doing, keeping that promise. Mason felt the weight of it, the promise, the responsibility, the love that had survived 2 years and still lived in the actions of 57 strangers. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Hawk seemed to understand. He stood up, brushing off his jeans. Come on, there's something I want to show you. Mason followed him across the yard to one of the motorcycles, a black cruiser with chrome accents and a leather saddlebag hanging off the side. Hawk crouched down, unbuckled the saddlebag, and pulled out a thick envelope. This belonged to your daddy, Hawk said, handing it to Mason. Kept it safe for you. Mason opened the envelope carefully. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. His father on a motorcycle, his father with Hawk, his father holding a baby Mason, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. There were pictures of campfires, open roads, sunsets over mountains. And at the bottom of the stack, a Polaroid with writing on the back. Mason flipped it over. Mason, age 3, best day of my life. The photo showed his father kneeling beside a tiny version of Mason, both of them covered in mud, laughing. Mason's vision blurred. He wiped his eyes quickly, but Hawk had already seen. It's okay to miss him, Hawk said quietly. Hell, I miss him too. Every day. Mason nodded, clutching the photograph. Hawk stood and placed a hand on his shoulder. Listen, kid. I know tonight's been a lot, but I need you to understand something. This isn't just about your birthday. This is about family. You're part of the Iron Vow now. That means you've got people. You've got protection. And if anyone ever tries to hurt you, if anyone ever makes you feel small, you call me. Understood? Mason looked up at him. Why would someone hurt me? Hawk's jaw tightened. Because the world's not always kind. And sometimes people don't like what we stand for. But that's not your problem, that's ours. You just be a kid. Let us handle the rest. Mason didn't fully understand, but he nodded anyway. Hawk smiled faintly. Good. Now get some sleep. Your grandma's going to be home soon, and she's going to have questions. Mason turned to head inside, but stopped at the door. Hawk? Yeah, kid? Thank you. Hawk's expression softened. Don't thank me. Thank your daddy. He's the one who made sure you'd never be alone. Mason went inside, clutching the envelope of photographs, and climbed into bed. Outside, the sound of engines filled the night as the riders prepared to leave. But they didn't leave empty-handed. They left carrying the weight of a promise kept, and the knowledge that David Pierce's son would never face the world alone. From a quiet suburban street in Ohio, a promise made 2 years ago has just been fulfilled. But this is only the beginning of Mason's story. Mason woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of his grandmother's voice drifting through the house. For a moment, he thought the night before had been a dream. The motorcycles, the riders, the gifts, the cake. But then he saw the leather jacket draped over the chair in his room, his name stitched across the back in white thread, and he knew it had been real. He climbed out of bed and walked into the kitchen, still wearing the clothes he'd fallen asleep in. His grandmother stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, her grey hair pulled back in a loose bun. She turned when she heard him and smiled, a tired, knowing smile. "Morning, birthday boy," she said. "Sleep okay?" Mason nodded, sliding into a chair at the small kitchen table. "Grandma, did you know?" She set a plate of pancakes in front of him, along with a glass of orange juice. "Know what, sweetheart? About the bikers, about Hawk, about all of it." His grandmother sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked older in the morning light, lines deeper around her eyes, shoulders sagging just a little. "I knew," she said quietly. "I've known for 2 years." Mason stared at her. "You knew they were watching us?" "I knew they were helping. Bills that got paid when I didn't have the money. Groceries that showed up on the porch. Your school supplies." She smiled faintly. "Your father's friends are good people, Mason. They kept their promise to him, and they kept us afloat when I didn't think we'd make it." "Why didn't you tell me?" His grandmother sighed. "Because you were 5 years old when your daddy died, then 6. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know if you'd understand." She reached across the table and took his hand. "But now you're 7, and I think you're old enough to know the truth. Your father loved you more than anything in this world, and the people who loved him want to make sure you're okay. That's all this is, love that didn't stop when he died." Mason looked down at his pancakes, his throat tight. "Do you think he'd be proud of me?" His grandmother squeezed his hand. "I know he would, every single day." They ate in silence for a while, the kitchen warm and quiet, but Mason's mind was racing. He kept thinking about Hawk's words from the night before. "If anyone ever tries to hurt you, if anyone ever makes you feel small, you call me." "Grandma," Mason said slowly, "Hawk said I'm part of something now, part of the Iron Vow." His grandmother nodded. "That's their way. They don't leave people behind, especially not family." "But I'm not really family, not like them." "You are," she said firmly. "Your daddy was their brother. That makes you their responsibility, and trust me, Mason, those people take responsibility seriously." Mason thought about the 57 riders who had shown up the night before, each one carrying a piece of his father's memory. "Do you think they'll come back?" His grandmother smiled. "I think you can count on it." She was right. 3 days later, Hawk returned. Mason was sitting on the porch after school, working on the model motorcycle kit one of the riders had given him. When he heard the familiar rumble of an engine, he looked up to see a black cruiser rolling down the street, slowing as it approached the house. Hawk pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. He swung off the bike, his boots crunching on the gravel, and walked over to where Mason sat. "How's it going, kid?" Hawk asked, nodding toward the half-built model. "Good," Mason said. "It's harder than I thought." Hawk chuckled. "Most things worth doing are." He sat down on the step beside Mason, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Got something for you." Mason set down the model and took the paper. It was a hand-drawn map, rough lines and labels in messy handwriting. At the top it said, "Iron Vow Clubhouse." "What's this?" Mason asked. "Address," Hawk said. "The clubhouse is about 20 minutes from here. Place where we meet, work on bikes, hang out. I'm inviting you." Mason looked up at him. "Really?" "Yeah. Your daddy used to bring you there when you were a baby. Figured it's time you saw it again." Hawk paused. "Your grandma said it's okay, but only if you want to." Mason didn't hesitate. "I want to." Hawk smiled. "Good. Saturday morning. I'll pick you up at 9. "On your bike?" "How else?" Mason's eyes widened. He'd never ridden on a motorcycle before. His grandmother had always said he was too young. But now, looking at Hawk's steady, confident expression, he felt something shift inside him, a spark of excitement mixed with nervousness. "Okay," Mason said. "I'll be ready." Hawk stood, brushing off his jeans. "Wear something warm and don't worry. I'll bring a helmet that fits." He started toward his bike, then stopped and turned back. "One more thing, kid. You ever have any trouble? At school, at home, anywhere? You let me know. Understood?" Mason nodded. "Understood." Hawk gave him a sharp nod, climbed onto his bike, and roared off down the street. Mason watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner, then looked back down at the map in his hands. For the first time since his father died, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that wouldn't disappear. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Mason woke before his alarm, too excited to sleep. He pulled on jeans, a hoodie, and the leather jacket the riders had given him. It was still too big, but he didn't care. He liked the weight of it on his shoulders. His grandmother made him breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, and watched him eat with a mixture of pride and worry. "You be careful," she said as Hawk's motorcycle rumbled into the driveway, "and listen to everything Hawk tells you." "I will," Mason promised. Hawk appeared at the door, holding a black helmet with flames painted on the sides. He handed it to Mason. "Let's go see where your daddy used to ride." Mason strapped on the helmet, climbed onto the back of the bike, and wrapped his arms around Hawk's waist. The engine roared to life beneath him, vibrating through his entire body. And then they were moving, wind rushing past, streets blurring, the world opening up in a way Mason had never experienced before. He felt free, alive, connected to something his father had loved. 20 minutes later, they pulled into a gravel lot in front of a low, weathered building with a hand-painted sign above the door. Iron Vow Brotherhood, Estra 1987. Hawk cut the engine and helped Mason off the bike. "Welcome home, kid." Mason looked up at the building, his heart pounding. Inside, he could hear voices, laughter, the clang of tools on metal. This was where his father had belonged. And now, so did he. Hawk pushed open the door, and Mason stepped inside. 56 faces turned to look at him, and every single one of them smiled. The clubhouse smelled like motor oil, leather, and old wood. Sunlight filtered through high windows, casting long beams across the concrete floor where motorcycles in various stages of repair sat like metal sculptures. Tools hung on pegboards along the walls, and in the back corner, a pool table sat beneath a low-hanging lamp, its green felt worn smooth by years of use. Mason stood just inside the doorway, taking it all in. The riders, some he recognized from his birthday, others he didn't, moved around the space with easy familiarity. A woman with short grey hair worked on an engine, her hands black with grease. 2 men sat at a table near the window, playing cards and drinking coffee. Another rider polished chrome on a vintage cruiser, humming under his breath. Hawk placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. "Come on, I'll show you around." They walked through the main room, past workbenches cluttered with parts and half-finished projects. Hawk pointed out different sections as they went. "That's where we do engine work. Over there's the parts storage. And that," he gestured toward a corner stacked with wooden crates, "that's where we keep the good stuff." "What good stuff?" Mason asked. Hawk grinned. "You'll find out when you're older." They passed a bulletin board covered in photographs, black and white images of riders from decades past, group shots at rallies, candid moments around campfires. And there, near the center, was a picture of Mason's father, arms crossed, leaning against a motorcycle, grinning like he didn't have a care in the world. Mason stopped, staring at the photo. Hawk followed his gaze. "That was taken about a year before you were born. He'd just finished restoring that bike. Took him 6 months, but he did it, rode that thing everywhere." He paused. "We still have it, actually. It's in the back." "You kept it?" "Of course we kept it. It's your dad's bike. Belongs to you now." Mason's chest tightened. "I can't ride a motorcycle." "Not yet," Hawk said, "but someday you will. And when that day comes, you'll ride your daddy's bike. That's a promise." They moved deeper into the clubhouse, past a small kitchen where someone was frying bacon, past a hallway lined with lockers, until they reached a heavy steel door at the back. Hawk pulled it open, revealing a dimly lit storage room filled with covered motorcycles. He walked to the far corner and pulled a tarp off one of the bikes, revealing a black cruiser with chrome accents and a leather seat worn smooth by years of use. It looked like the bike in the photograph, only older, quieter, like it had been waiting. "This was his," Hawk said simply. Mason stepped closer, running his fingers along the handlebars. The metal was cool under his touch. He could almost imagine his father here, swinging a leg over the seat, firing up the engine, riding off into the sunset. Hawk watched him silently, then spoke. "Your daddy loved this bike, but he loved you more. That's why he stopped riding as much after you were born, didn't want to take risks, wanted to be there for you." Mason looked up at him. "But he still rode sometimes, right?" "Yeah, he still rode, because riding was part of who he was. But he was careful, always wore his gear, always checked his bike. He did everything right." Hawk's voice hardened slightly. "What happened to him? That wasn't his fault. That was a factory accident, a machine malfunction, nothing he could have prevented." Mason nodded. Though the guilt still lingered in the back of his mind, the irrational thought that somehow, if he'd been different, better, his father might still be alive. Hawk seemed to sense it. "Kid, listen to me. Your daddy died because of bad equipment and a company that cut corners. Not because of you, not because of anything you did or didn't do. You hear me?" Mason swallowed hard. "I hear you." "Good." Hawk covered the bike again, gently, like tucking in a sleeping child. "Come on, let's get you something to eat." They returned to the main room, where someone had set out a spread of food on a long table: bacon, eggs, toast, and what looked like homemade biscuits. Mason filled a plate and sat down at one of the tables. Hawk sat across from him, joined by the woman with short grey hair who'd been working on the engine earlier. "Mason, this is Raven," Hawk said. "Best mechanic we've got." Raven wiped her hands on a rag and extended one to Mason. Her grip was firm, her hands rough with calluses. "Heard a lot about you, kid. Your daddy used to brag about you non-stop." Mason shook her hand. "He did?" "Oh, yeah. Drove us all crazy." She smiled, but we didn't mind. It was good to see him happy. Over the next hour, more riders drifted over to introduce themselves. There was Bear, a massive man with a thick beard and a surprisingly gentle voice. There was Lila, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who ran logistics for the crew. There was Smoke, Jax, Red, Diesel, and at least a dozen others whose names Mason struggled to remember. But what struck him most wasn't their names. It was the way they looked at him, with warmth, with recognition, with the kind of unspoken bond that said, "You're one of us now." As the morning wore on, Mason found himself relaxing. He watched Raven work on an engine, explaining each step as she went. He helped Bear organize tools, learning the names of wrenches and sockets. He even played a game of pool with a rider named Copper, who let him win, without making it obvious. Around noon, Hawk called everyone together. The riders gathered in a loose circle, 57 strong, engines silent, attention focused. Hawk stood in the center, one hand resting on Mason's shoulder. "Most of you already know," Hawk began, "but I want to say it out loud. 2 years ago we lost a brother, David Pierce. Good man, good rider, good father." He paused, his voice steady but heavy. "Before he died, David made us promise to look after his boy, to make sure Mason knew he wasn't alone, to make sure he grew up knowing what it means to be part of a family." The riders nodded, murmuring agreement. "Today," Hawk continued, "we're making good on that promise. Mason's part of the Iron Vow now. which means he's under our protection. He's got 57 brothers and sisters who'll ride for him, fight for him, stand for him, no matter what." Hawk looked down at Mason. "You understand what that means, kid?" Mason nodded, his throat tight. "Good." Hawk raised his voice slightly. "If anyone ever messes with this boy, if anyone ever tries to hurt him, scare him, or make him feel small, they answer to us, all of us. Understood?" A chorus of voices rose in unison. "Understood." Hawk smiled faintly. "All right, let's ride." The riders dispersed, heading to their bikes. Hawk led Mason outside, where the motorcycles sat gleaming in the midday sun. "You ever been on a group ride?" Hawk asked. Mason shook his head. "Then you're in for a treat." Hawk handed him the helmet again, and Mason climbed onto the back of the bike. One by one, the other riders fired up their engines, the sound building into a symphony of thunder. And then they were moving, 57 motorcycles rolling out in perfect formation, Mason at the center, wind in his face, heart pounding with something that felt like belonging. For the first time in 2 years, Mason Pierce didn't feel lost. He felt found. Monday morning came too fast. Mason walked through the front doors of Lincoln Elementary with his backpack slung over one shoulder and the silver ring, his father's ring, on his thumb. The weekend had felt like a dream. The clubhouse, the riders, the sense of belonging. But now he was back in the world where none of that mattered, where he was just another quiet kid who kept his head down and tried not to be noticed. He made his way to his classroom and slid into his seat near the back. The other kids were already talking, laughing, comparing notes from the weekend. Mason pulled out a notebook and started drawing. A motorcycle, its chrome details taking shape under his pencil. "Hey, Mason." He looked up. Tyler Grant stood beside his desk, tall for a 7-year-old, with a sharp smile that never quite reached his eyes. Tyler was the kind of kid who always knew where the line was and how far he could push before a teacher noticed. "What do you want?" Mason asked quietly. Tyler leaned in, lowering his voice. "Heard you had some bikers show up at your house on your birthday, that true?" Mason's grip tightened on his pencil. "So, what if it is?" "So," Tyler said, grinning, "that's weird. Why would a bunch of old guys on motorcycles care about you?" Mason didn't answer. He turned back to his drawing, hoping Tyler would lose interest and walk away. But Tyler didn't move. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Mason could hear. "My dad says bikers are criminals. He says they sell drugs and hurt people. He says they're dangerous." Mason's jaw clenched. "Your dad's wrong." Tyler laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Whatever, just saying if you hang out with criminals, people are going to think you're a criminal too." Before Mason could respond, the teacher walked in, and Tyler slipped back to his seat, still smirking. Mason spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on classwork, but Tyler's words kept circling in his head. Criminals. Dangerous. He thought about Hawk, about Raven, about the riders who had shown up on his birthday with gifts and cake and kindness. They weren't criminals, they were family. But Tyler's words stung, because Mason knew how the world saw people like Hawk. He'd heard the whispers before, his grandmother talking on the phone with a friend, lowering her voice when she mentioned the bikers, the way neighbors looked when motorcycles rolled down the street, the way people assumed the worst before knowing the truth. At lunch, Mason sat alone at a corner table, eating a peanut butter sandwich his grandmother had packed. Tyler and his friends sat a few tables away, laughing loudly, occasionally glancing in Mason's direction. Then Tyler stood up and walked over. "Hey, Mason," he said loudly, so the whole cafeteria could hear. "Is it true your dad was a criminal too? Is that why he died?" The cafeteria went quiet. Every head turned toward Mason. Mason's face burned, his hands curled into fists under the table. He wanted to say something, to defend his father, to tell Tyler to shut up, to scream that his father was a good man who died because a factory didn't care enough to fix a broken machine. But the words wouldn't come. Tyler smirked. That's what I thought. He turned and walked back to his table, his friends laughing. The noise of the cafeteria resumed, but Mason couldn't hear it. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. He threw the rest of his lunch away and left the cafeteria, walking quickly toward the bathroom. He locked himself in a stall and sat down, pressing his palms against his eyes, trying not to cry. His father wasn't a criminal. He wasn't. But nobody here knew that. Nobody here cared. Mason stayed in the bathroom until the bell rang, then dragged himself through the rest of the day. When the final bell sounded, he grabbed his backpack and headed for the exit, keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact. He was halfway across the parking lot when he heard a voice behind him. "Mason, wait up!" He turned. It was Emily Carter, a girl from his class. She had curly red hair and glasses that were always sliding down her nose. She wasn't part of Tyler's group, but she wasn't really part of any group. Like Mason, she mostly kept to herself. "You okay?" she asked, jogging up beside him. Mason shrugged. "I'm fine." "Tyler's a jerk," Emily said matter-of-factly. "Don't listen to him." "I don't." "Good." She adjusted her glasses. "For what it's worth, I don't think your dad was a criminal. I think Tyler's just jealous because nobody showed up for his birthday." Mason managed a faint smile. "Thanks." Emily nodded and headed toward the bus line. Mason watched her go, feeling a little less alone. He walked home slowly, the afternoon sun warm on his face. When he reached his grandmother's house, he found her in the kitchen, folding laundry. She looked up as he came in. "How was school, sweetheart?" Mason dropped his backpack by the door. "Fine." His grandmother studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp. "You sure?" Mason hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, but he also didn't want to lie. Some kid at school. He said stuff about Dad, about the bikers. His grandmother's expression hardened. "What kind of stuff?" "He said bikers are criminals. He said Dad was a criminal." His grandmother set down the laundry and crossed the room, pulling Mason into a hug. "Your father was not a criminal. He was a good man who worked hard and loved his family. Don't you ever let anyone tell you different." Mason nodded against her shoulder. "I know." She pulled back, looking him in the eye. "If that boy keeps bothering you, you tell me, or better yet, you tell Hawk. I guarantee that'll put an end to it real quick." Mason almost smiled at the thought of Hawk showing up at Tyler's house, but he shook his head. "I don't want to cause trouble." "Standing up for yourself isn't causing trouble," his grandmother said firmly. "It's called self-respect. And your father would want you to have plenty of that." Mason thought about that as he headed to his room. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to stop letting people like Tyler make him feel small. He pulled out the map Hawk had given him, the one with the clubhouse address, and for the first time he thought about what it really meant to be part of the Iron Vow. It meant he wasn't alone. And if Tyler ever said something like that again, Mason would make sure he knew it. If this story is reminding you why loyalty and family matter, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. 3 weeks passed. Mason went to school, came home, did his homework and tried to ignore Tyler Grant. It wasn't always easy. Tyler had a way of showing up when Mason least expected it, in the hallway, at recess, in the cafeteria, always with a smirk, always with something to say. But Mason didn't react. He remembered what his grandmother had said. Standing up for yourself isn't causing trouble. And he remembered what Hawk had told him. If anyone ever tries to hurt you, if anyone ever makes you feel small, you call me. Mason hadn't called yet. He wanted to handle it himself. But then came the Friday afternoon that changed everything. It was after school. Mason had stayed late to finish a project in the library, and by the time he left, the buses were gone and the parking lot was mostly empty. He started walking home, taking the shortcut through the park that shaved 10 minutes off the trip. He was halfway across the park when he heard voices behind him. "Hey, Mason, wait up!" He turned. Tyler and two of his friends were walking toward him, their expressions not quite friendly, not quite hostile, just intent. Mason's stomach tightened. "What do you want, Tyler?" Tyler stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, casual. "Just wanted to talk." "About what?" "About your biker friends." Tyler's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My dad says they're gonna get shut down soon. Says the cops are watching them. Says it's only a matter of time before they all end up in jail." Mason felt heat rising in his chest. "Your dad doesn't know what he's talking about." "Oh, yeah?" Tyler stepped closer. "Then why do they wear those vests with the patches? Why do they ride around like they own the place? You think that's normal?" "They're not criminals," Mason said, his voice shaking. "They're just people. People who scare everyone," one of Tyler's friends chimed in. "People who make the neighborhood look bad," the other added. Tyler grinned. "Face it, Mason, your dad was a loser who hung out with losers, and now you're one too." Something inside Mason snapped. He didn't think, he just moved. His fist connected with Tyler's jaw, hard enough to send the older boy stumbling backward, eyes wide with shock. Tyler touched his mouth, saw blood on his fingers, and his expression shifted from surprise to rage. "You're dead!" Tyler snarled. He lunged at Mason. They hit the ground hard, rolling across the grass, fists flying. Mason felt pain explode across his cheek, tasted blood in his mouth, but he didn't stop. He swung again, catching Tyler in the ribs. Tyler's friends shouted, but they didn't jump in. They just watched, eyes wide, as the two boys fought. And then it was over. A hand grabbed Mason by the back of his shirt and pulled him off Tyler. He struggled, but the grip was too strong. He looked up and saw a man in a security uniform, one of the park rangers. "Enough!" the ranger barked. "Both of you on your feet!" Mason stood, breathing hard, his hands shaking. Tyler scrambled up, wiping blood from his lip, glaring at Mason with pure hatred. The ranger looked between them. "What the hell is going on here?" "He hit me!" Tyler shouted, pointing at Mason. "For no reason." "That's not true," Mason started, but the ranger cut him off. "I don't care who started it. Fighting's not allowed in the park. I'm calling your parents." Mason's stomach dropped. His grandmother was at work. She wouldn't be home for hours, and he didn't have anyone else to call, except he did. The ranger led them both to the park office, a small building near the entrance. He made Tyler call his father first. 10 minutes later, a man in a suit showed up, looking furious. He barely glanced at Mason before dragging Tyler out the door. Then the ranger turned to Mason. "Your turn. Who should I call?" Mason pulled out his phone, a basic flip phone his grandmother had given him for emergencies. His hands were still shaking. He scrolled through the contacts until he found the number Hawk had made him save. He dialed. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Mason." "Hawk," Mason said, his voice cracking. "I need help." There was a pause, just a heartbeat, and then Hawk's voice came back, steady and certain. "Where are you?" "Lincoln Park, the office. Don't move. I'm on my way." The line went dead. The ranger raised an eyebrow. "Who was that?" "My uncle," Mason lied. It was easier than explaining. "He better get here fast," the ranger muttered, turning back to his paperwork. Mason sat in a plastic chair, staring at the floor, replaying the fight in his head. He'd thrown the first punch. He'd lost control. His grandmother was going to be so disappointed. But a small part of him, a part he didn't want to admit existed, felt something else. Satisfaction. Tyler had spent weeks making him feel small, and for once Mason had stood up. Maybe he'd done it the wrong way, but at least he'd done it. 10 minutes later, he heard the sound of an engine pulling into the parking lot. Then another, then several more. Mason looked up. Through the office window, he saw Hawk dismount from his bike. Behind him, 5 other riders did the same. Raven, Bear, Copper, Lila, and Smoke. They moved with the same quiet intensity Mason had seen at the clubhouse, purposeful and unshakable. Hawk walked into the office, his eyes immediately finding Mason. He crossed the room in 3 strides and crouched down, studying Mason's face, the bruise forming under his eye, the cut on his lip. "You okay?" Hawk asked, his voice low. Mason nodded. "I'm okay." Hawk stood and turned to the ranger. "What happened?" The ranger explained. "Fight in the park, both boys involved, parents called." Hawk listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When the ranger finished, Hawk nodded once. "Can I take him home?" The ranger hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine by me. Just make sure he stays out of trouble." "He will." Hawk placed a hand on Mason's shoulder and led him outside, where the other riders were waiting. Raven took one look at Mason's face and frowned. "Who hit you?" she asked. "Kid from school," Mason mumbled. Bear grunted. "Kid got a name." "Tyler Grant." Bear exchanged a look with Hawk. "Want us to pay him a visit?" "No," Hawk said firmly. "This stays between us and the kid." Bear didn't look happy, but he nodded. Hawk handed Mason a helmet. "Come on, let's get you home." They rode in silence, the wind cold against Mason's bruised face. When they reached his grandmother's house, Hawk walked him to the door, the other riders waiting on the street. "You did the right thing calling me," Hawk said. "I started the fight," Mason admitted. "I threw the first punch." Hawk studied him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because he said my dad was a loser." Hawk's expression hardened. "And what do you think?" Mason looked up at him, eyes fierce. "I think my dad was a hero." Hawk's face softened. He placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. "Then you and I are on the same page." He paused. "But next time someone tries to make you feel small, don't use your fists, use your words, or call me. Got it?" Mason nodded. "Good." Hawk turned to leave, then stopped. "Mason?" "Yeah? Your dad would be proud of you." And with that, Hawk walked back to his bike and rode off into the night, 56 engines roaring behind him. Mason stood on the porch, watching until the lights disappeared. And for the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was strong enough to face whatever came next. The fight at the park should have ended there. Mason had expected a lecture from his grandmother, maybe some grounding. What he didn't expect was the phone call that came 2 days later. It was Sunday evening. Mason sat at the kitchen table, working on homework, when the landline rang. His grandmother answered, her voice cheerful at first, then cautious, then cold. She hung up and turned to Mason, her face pale. "That was Tyler Grant's father," she said quietly. "He's filing a complaint with the school, says you assaulted his son." Mason's stomach dropped. "But Tyler started it." "I know, sweetheart, I believe you, but Mr. Grant is claiming you attacked Tyler unprovoked, and he's pushing for disciplinary action." Mason felt the world tilt beneath him. "What does that mean?" His grandmother sat down across from him, her hands folded tightly on the table. "It means the school's going to investigate, and depending on what they find, you could be suspended, or worse." "But I didn't start it." "I know," she said again, her voice strained. "But it's your word against his, and Mr. Grant. He's got connections. He's on the school board. He knows people." She reached across the table and took Mason's hand. "We're going to fight this. I promise. But it's not going to be easy." That night, Mason lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the fight over and over. He'd thrown the first punch. That much was true, but Tyler had pushed him to it. Weeks of insults, taunts, lies about his father. He thought about calling Hawk. But what could Hawk do? This wasn't something that could be fixed with motorcycles and promises. This was the system. Schools, boards, rules that didn't care about context or fairness. Monday morning came too fast. Mason walked into Lincoln Elementary with his grandmother beside him, both of them heading straight to the principal's office. The secretary looked up as they entered. her expression neutral but not unkind. "Mrs. Pierce, Mason, Principal Hodges is expecting you." They were led into a small office where a tall man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses sat behind a desk. Principal Hodges gestured to the two chairs across from him. "Please sit." Mason and his grandmother sat. Mason's hands were sweating. His grandmother's jaw was set. Hodges folded his hands on the desk. "I'll get straight to the point. We've received a complaint from Mr. Grant regarding an altercation between Mason and his son, Tyler. According to Mr. Grant, Mason attacked Tyler without provocation." "That's not true," Mason's grandmother said immediately. "My grandson was defending himself." Hodges nodded slowly. "I understand that's your perspective. However, we have to investigate all claims thoroughly. And given the seriousness of the accusation, we're placing Mason on temporary suspension pending the outcome of that investigation." Mason's heart sank. "Suspension." "It's standard procedure," Hodges said. "It doesn't mean we've made a final determination, but until we've had a chance to review the facts, we think it's best if Mason stays home for a few days." His grandmother leaned forward, her voice sharp. "And what about Tyler? Is he being suspended too?" Hodges hesitated. "Tyler sustained injuries in the altercation. We're treating him as the victim at this time." "The victim?" Mason's grandmother's voice rose. "My grandson has bruises too. Why is Tyler automatically the victim?" "Mr. Grant has provided witness statements from Tyler's friends," she interrupted. "Of course they're going to side with him." Hodges adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Pierce, I understand you're upset, but the decision stands. Mason is suspended for 3 days, effective immediately." They left the office in silence. Mason felt numb. Outside, his grandmother stopped on the steps, her hands shaking with anger. "This isn't fair," she muttered. "This isn't right." That evening, Mason sat on the porch, watching the sun set. He heard an engine before he saw it. Hawk's motorcycle pulling into the driveway. Hawk dismounted and walked over, reading Mason's expression instantly. What happened? Mason told him everything. The complaint, the suspension, Mr. Grant's connections. Hawk's jaw tightened. "They suspended you? Not the other kid?" "Tyler's dad is on the school board." Hawk was silent for a long moment, then pulled out his phone. "I need to make some calls." "Hawk, you can't." "Watch me." Hawk dialed a number, stepping away. Mason heard fragments of the conversation. "Need your help. School board corruption. Kid being railroaded." When Hawk returned, his expression was determined. "We're not letting this stand. The Brotherhood has resources, lawyers, people who know how to fight systems like this. We're going to appeal the suspension and file our own complaint." "Against who?" "Against Tyler Grant and his father for making false statements. Against the school for biased enforcement." Hawk crouched down to Mason's level. "Your daddy taught me something. When the system fails you, you don't give up. You fight smarter." Over the next 48 hours, things moved fast. Hawk brought a lawyer named Sarah Chen, a woman in her 40s who'd represented the Brotherhood before. She interviewed Mason, took photos of his injuries, and requested the park ranger's incident report. She also did something Mason didn't expect. She contacted Emily Carter, the girl from his class who'd called Tyler a jerk. Emily confirmed she'd seen Tyler harassing Mason for weeks. 2 other students came forward with similar stories. By Wednesday, Sarah had compiled a 20-page document and submitted it to the school district. Thursday morning, Mason's grandmother received a call. Principal Hodges wanted to meet again. This time, Sarah Chen came with them. Hodges looked uncomfortable as they entered. "After reviewing additional evidence, we've decided to lift Mason's suspension effective immediately." "And Tyler?" Sarah asked coolly. "Tyler Grant will be serving a 3-day suspension for bullying and making false statements." Mason's grandmother exhaled slowly. "What about Mr. Grant's complaint?" It's been withdrawn. Hodges paused. We take these matters seriously, Mrs. Pierce. I apologize for the initial mishandling. Sarah stood. I trust this won't happen again. It won't. Outside, Mason turned to Hawk, who'd been waiting on his motorcycle. You did this. Hawk shrugged. We all did. That's what family does. Mason felt something solid settle in his chest, not just relief, but understanding. The iron vow wasn't just about motorcycles and leather vests. It was about standing up when the world tried to push you down. Thank you, Mason said. Hawk smiled. Don't thank me yet, kid. We're just getting started. 3 months later, Mason stood in the clubhouse workshop, holding a wrench and watching Raven adjust the carburetor on a vintage bike. The iron vow had become his second home. Weekends spent learning mechanics. Evenings hearing stories about his father, nights understanding what it meant to belong. School had changed too. Tyler kept his distance after the suspension. Emily Carter became a real friend. And slowly, Mason learned to speak up when people made assumptions about bikers or his father. One Saturday, Hawk called everyone together for a group ride, 57 motorcycles rolling through the city in formation. Mason rode behind Hawk, the wind in his face, feeling his father's presence in every mile. They stopped at a hilltop overlooking the valley. Hawk dismounted and walked to where Mason stood, looking out over the landscape. Your daddy and I used to come here, Hawk said quietly. He'd talk about you, about what kind of man he hoped you'd become. What did he say? He said he hoped you'd be brave, that you'd stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Hawk placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. I think he'd be proud of who you're becoming. Mason looked down at the silver ring on his thumb, his father's ring, now fitting better as he grew. I'm proud to be his son. He knew you would be. Behind them, the 56 other riders gathered, engines silent, watching the sunset. Raven stood beside Bear, Lila beside Copper. All of them connected by something stronger than blood, by choice, by loyalty, by promises kept across time and distance. Mason turned to face them, feeling the weight of belonging settle around him like armor. Thank you, he said, his voice carrying across the hilltop, for keeping your promise, for being my family. Hawk smiled. We didn't do it because we had to, kid. We did it because we wanted to. Because that's what brothers and sisters do. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and in that moment Mason understood something fundamental. His father hadn't left him alone. He'd left him with something better, a family that would ride through fire for him, a legacy of honor and loyalty, and the knowledge that some promises are so sacred they survive even death. As they mounted their bikes and prepared to ride home, Mason looked back one last time at the sunset, and he could have sworn he heard his father's voice on the wind, saying the same thing Hawk had told him months ago. You're not alone, son. You never were. The engines roared to life. 57 motorcycles rolled down the mountain in perfect formation, and Mason Pierce, 7 years old, son of David Pierce, member of the Iron Vow Brotherhood, rode home knowing he was exactly where he belonged. Thank you for following Mason's journey from a lonely birthday to finding his place in a family bound by honor and love. If this story moved you, please subscribe to see more tales of courage, loyalty, and the promises that never break. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts. I read every single one. Until next time, ride safe and keep your promises.